Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual iteration of the City Lights events calendar. Tonight, City Lights booksellers and publishers, in conjunction with the Legal Defense Fund, are pleased to present a remembrance of Emmett Till. I am your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight's event celebrates the publication of the new book, Tragedy on Trial, the story of the infamous Emmett Till murder trial. It's authored by Ronald K. Collins and is published by Carolina Academic Press. Before we begin, as is customary before each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. We would like to take this moment in an offering of respect for those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Emmett Lewis Till was a 14-year-old African-American youth who was abducted and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman. The sheer brutality of his murder and the acquittal of his killers are moments of infamy in our nation's past. The shockwaves sent across the country cast a light on the long history of violent persecution of African Americans in the United States. The book Tragedy on Trial reveals, as never before, the entire and shocking story of the 1955 trial of Emmett Till's murderers. Based on extensive research and accompanied by photos of the trial and an introduction by Lonnie G, who's the secretary of the Smithsonian, Ronald Collins brings the story to life, revealing all of its manipulations of justice and giving us a moment of pause for our current time of national crisis. Ronald Collins has served as the Harold S. Scheffelman Scholar at the University of Washington School of Law and is currently retired. He is the editor of First Amendment News. He has written constitutional briefs presented to the Supreme Court and various other federal and state high courts. In addition to the 9 books that he co-authored with David Scover, he is the editor of Oliver Wendell Holmes, A Free Speech Reader, published in 2010, and co-author with Sam Charlton of We Must Not Be Afraid to Be Free, published in 2011. He also authored Nuanced Absolutism, Floyd Abrams and the First Amendment. I might add, he also co-authored with David Scover a wonderful book on the Howell trial called The People versus Ferlinghetti. We have very fond memories of an event that we did with them both. Ron also has a forthcoming novel in the works titled Forbidden Freedom, which is about an attempt by a Southern state aided by the Trump administration to overrule the gay rights precedents, or credence, I should say. It is, in Ron's words, fiction bordering on realism, since actually such plans are currently being formulated in conservative legal circles. So joining him in conversation tonight, we are greatly honored to have with us Karla McKanders. Karla McKanders is the director of the Thurgood Marshall Institute. Her research has been published in esteemed law journals such as the Georgia State Law Review, the Harvard Journal on Racial and Ethnic Justice, University of Iowa's Gender, Race and Social Justice Law Journal, and the Catholic Law Review. She is the author of the book Immigration and Racial Justice, Enforcing the Borders of Blackness, published in 2021, and the editor of the volume Arabs at Home in the World, Human Rights, Gender Politics, and Identity, which is a collaboration with scholars from the Middle East, North Africa, and the United States. She has a forthcoming book coming out titled The Color of Water. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Ronald K. Collins and Karla McKanders. It is such a great honor having you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. As my mother might have said, El gusto es mío, the pleasure is mine. And what a delight, Peter, to be speaking at an independent bookstore. Yes, they still survive. And the way they survive is by those of us keeping them alive. And so I can't say enough about independent bookstores, particularly this one, which has such a rich tradition of defending civil rights and civil liberties. So a big thank you to the good folks at City Lights Books. Peter, before I actually kind of jump into things, I'd like to read 2 passages that I think kind of help set up things for the time. One is by Congressman Bobby Rush, who wrote the foreword to the book, and I was very fortunate that he did that. And I'd like to just read a few sentences from that foreword that Congressman Rush who knew Mamie Till Mobley. He writes, quote, "In our human condition, rage cannot and must not exist in a vacuum. Martyrs must not be robbed of the catalytic power of their martyrdom. Martyrs, even the innocent and young like Emmet, are God's instruments for his purposes and his shalom and our collective well-being." I don't think anybody could have said it better than Congressman Bobby Rush. And I'd like to read a passage from this book, all right, published by the founder of City Lights Books, Lawrence Fairland Getty. And it's a book I strongly recommend. I mean, if ever there's a book for a time, it's a Poetry as Insurgent Art by Lawrence Fairland Getty. I'd like to just read a passage from it because I think it's so timely. He says, "Governments lie. The voice of the government is often not the voice of the people. Speak up, act out. Silence is complicity. Be the gadfly of the state and also its firefly." Lawrence Fairland Getty. So it's against that backdrop that I'd like to begin. And by the way, talking about the importance of social activism, I see that one of my longtime friends is in the audience. I'd like to recognize her and for the great work she does when it comes to social justice. And that, of course, is my very close friend there in California, your own Rabbi Susan Singer. So Suzanne, great to see you and thank you for joining us. So with that, let us get started. Karla, are you ready?
I think so. Very excited to be here and engaging in this conversation.
By the way, at this time, at this pinpoint in time, groups like the Legal Defense Fund, which are there challenging executive orders and have just prevailed in a case with Lambda Legal, are really doing the nation and protecting the nation and our values and our constitutional values a great service, along with the ACLU and its state chapters. And so I just want to give shout outs to them and urge you to support them however best you can, because the work they're doing now, I think, is more important than ever. So let us begin a little bit, just a little setup before we actually get into the trial and what have you, about what happened 70 years ago. This is the 70th anniversary. So back in August of 1955, Emmett Till, who's living in Chicago, he gets this chance to go visit his cousins in Mississippi, all right? And he's going to go there with his uncle Moses Wright and his cousin. They're going to take a train there. He's there, by the way, before he goes there, his mother gives him some kind of do's and don'ts and what have you. We're going to be talking about that some more. But he goes there and he's spending time with his cousins. And after a few days, they venture off with some cousins and a few friends to a place called Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market, which I guess about 95% of the people that went to that small market were African-American. He goes there. He's there with one of his cousins inside for a while. Cousin leaves. He's sitting there with a woman named Carolyn Bryant, whose husband, Roy Bryant, owns the place. Some things go on. We're not quite sure what goes on because there's only two people there at the time. But time starts to pass and his cousins get worried because he's there alone. And so they go in and they pull him out. There's some controversy back and forth about what actually happened in there. We don't know for certain. There's all sorts of allegations, some of which, or many of which, are not provable. But in any event, when Carolyn Bryant comes out, Emmet whistles. And just so we're clear, there's no doubt that he whistled. His cousins were there. They say it. He whistled. They immediately realize the danger of that. So they leave immediately. They drive as quickly as they can back home. But they make a fatal mistake. They don't tell his great uncle, Moses Wright, They don't tell him what happened. And that mistake will cause Emmet his life. So what happens thereafter is some time passes. Roy Bryant is off, I believe, in Louisiana. He comes back. His wife, Carolyn, says nothing to him about this. Somebody else, farmhand, tells Roy Bryant. Roy Bryant is a man with a short fuse and very much a racist. But somebody with a shorter fuse and even more bigoted is J.W. Milo. And so the two of them decide that they're going to go out to Moses Wright's place. It's the middle of the night. It's like 2 a.m. They knock on the door with guns and a flashlight, and they ask, where's the boy from Chicago? They kidnap Emmett Till. And this is very important because the defendants are never, they're arrested later on, as we'll say. They're arrested for kidnapping and murder, but they're only charged for murder. And that's very important. But in any event, they take him away. Now, according to their story, they will later say that they asked Carolyn, is this the boy? She said, no, that's their story. It's false. And they say, and we let him go and we don't know what happened to him. That's their first story. But in any event, sometime thereafter, his body surfaces in the Tallahatchie River. He'd been beaten brutally. He'd been shot in the head. And a heavy cotton gin wheel was tied around his neck with barbed wire. All right. And so it is at that point, all right, that Mamie Till, if you could imagine the mother getting wind of this story about her 14-year-old son, is told, and she leaves Chicago to come to Mississippi. By order of the sheriff, that body, his body, was to be buried in a black cemetery immediately. And it was sealed. And per the sheriff's proclamation, it could not be opened under order of law, so the sheriff said. So in order to get the body from Mississippi to Chicago, the mortuary and Mamie Till, Bradley, then later Mamie Till Mobley, had to sign a statement that they would not, under any circumstances, open the casket. So it is against that backdrop that we come to the open casket funeral. And this is before the defendants are indicted, all right? And Mamie Till decides they're not going to have demonstrations. She's not going to remain silent, but she's going to have this open casket funeral. Emmett's face was so disfigured that even at the mortuary, they really couldn't put it together. You couldn't tell if it was a young man, an old man, if it was a white person, a black person. Even after they had done everything, it still was rather frightening and almost monster-like. But she decides, she said, I want the world to see what they've done to my boy. And thousands of people come to that funeral. There were nurses there that had to help people who were passing out. Mothers and fathers had brought their young children to look at the face of Emmett Till. All right. The reason I mentioned the open casket funeral, and I want to get into this somewhat with Karla, is that there had been 500 lynchings in Mississippi prior to this, and none of them had ever received any attention. None of them, very few had even gone to trial, all right? But this one changed that story. The story went international, all right? And if you ask me, what point in time, what pinpoint in time best marks the advent of the modern civil rights movement? Would it be Brown v. Board? Would it be Rosa Parks getting, on the bus, staying on the bus? I'd say no. I would say, as important as those were, it was the open casket funeral. That, and yet the vast majority of textbooks used in grade schools, in high schools, in colleges have little or no mention of the open casket funeral. There's something else that happened as well, and that is the photos that appeared in Jet magazine. But let me pause before I get to that and ask Karla about, and by the way, before I get, this happened on September 3rd in 1955 at the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, which has now become a national monument. But Karla, I just would like to hear some of your views about the significance of that open casket funeral.
This is particularly significant for me because my father's side of the family is from Belzoni, Mississippi, and my father was born in 1950. And the story of Emmett Till was one that really impacted the life of my father, and one of those stories that is passed down from generation to generation. His family moved from Belzoni to outside of Detroit, Michigan, um, and would go down annually to Mississippi to visit family members. And right before Emmett Till was murdered, he was a NAACP voting rights activist, Reverend George Lee, was murdered for registering Black voters. And my grandmother was in Belzoni. This took place in Belzoni. And my father remembers the retelling of that story and how the community right after it happened was told not to go out, not to, to stay indoors, that it was dangerous to go outside after this happened. And a few weeks later, another person was murdered, voting rights activist Lamar Smith. And these names weren't, as Ron said, in the news, but they're part of kind of the oral histories that are passed down through Black families, and it shapes our understanding of what it means to challenge white supremacy, and it shapes what it means to be, for my dad, a Black male. And he was only 5 years old, but he remembers the picture in Jet magazine, and he refused to go with his family to Mississippi for years until he was an adult. And so it's really a turning point for not only the civil rights movement, but within the African American, the Black community, a turning point in terms of the way that we view the criminal legal system and the way we view justice in the United States.
So you mentioned Jet magazine. So it's another really important story. It's said that the dead live on the lips of the living, and that's why the Emmett Till story has to continue generation after generation after generation. And part of that story has to do with a photographer named David Jackson and some photographs he took. So when Mamie Till has the casket moved from Mississippi to Chicago, and by the way, ask yourself, where did the money for that come from? She didn't have the money. It was all donations at the time. The casket is brought to an African American, brought to a Black mortuary. And the photographer in Jet magazine, David Jackson, asks if he can take some photos. Mamie Till, Bradley then says yes. So he's there taking photos, close-up photos, all right? And also of Mamie and others in the room. Those photos went to Jet magazine, which was published by Robert Johnson. Jet magazine was a small magazine that published stories about social life and sports and what have you. It didn't publish macabre photos of dead African children, but it did when it came to Emmett Till. And those photographs, all right, I think that issue sold 400,000 copies. And when I was writing this book, every African-American person, not most, not many, every single one over 50, when I mentioned Emmett Till, they all said Jet magazine. It was one of those pinpoints in time that just changed everything. I mean, it just changed everything. And yet, Robert Johnson and David Jackson, to the best of my knowledge, have never been honored, not in any significant way. And the significance of Jet magazine and what it did in publishing those photos is so significant. And I think, in writing this, I thought, God, even though this is about the trial, and by the way, this all happens before the trial, right? Before they're even indicted. And so that issue of Jet magazine had an enormous impact on Black Americans. And those photos, by the way, they appeared nowhere else. They did not appear in any publications other than a Jet magazine and a couple of other African-American publications. Photography, its significance. Karla, talk to us about that.
I think it marks a moment where it reinforces this reality of the South being a dangerous place, especially for Black men and families like mine who left the South for the Great Migration to work in auto plants, had to return, and give like that talk, and they had to navigate these unspoken rules of survival. um, Before each trip, my father's siblings were given this talk, the same talk that Black parents give their children today, especially for Black boys. And we have contemporary equivalents today with the Emmett Till story. If we think about the images, the videos that were taken of George Floyd, of police killings, and the photos of grieving Black mothers. Um, Mamie Till set the tone for taking the narrative and, taking the narrative and making it her own. And we're still, grappling with that trauma of racial violence in our society. We're still trying to make these stories, make sure these stories are told, and that um, what these stories do is what we call witnessing. It's the power of seeing things with your own eyes, the power of experiencing, the pain that a mother has to go through when they see, their child disfigured like this is, transformative. Um, and so it's unfortunately still lives on today in terms of how we navigate our society, how we engage with law enforcement as Black people in our society.
Your colleague and the president of the Legal Defense Fund, Janae Nelson, one of the
Mhm.
things she said, and I remember kind of echoes what you just said, is that what Mamie Till did is claimed agency. I'm not going to let
Yes.
others tell this story. I'm going to tell this story, all right? And I'm going to tell it the way I want it. And what an incredible, there couldn't have been any demonstration. I mean, if it had been a demonstration, it would just been another in a long line of demonstrations.
Mhm.
Demonstrations aren't important. And someone who believes firmly in the First Amendment, I do believe in the right to protest. But the idea of having this open casket funeral and thinking about that, of a mother having this disfigured face shown to the world and then published in Jet magazine. I mean, it's like, and so I thought when Janae said, claiming agency, I thought that was a really important point. And when you think about the importance of dissent, all right, what a great,
Mhm.
of all the things, of all the years I've taught First Amendment law, one of the key elements of First Amendment law is what is called symbolic speech.
Mhm.
Nowhere in any First Amendment book taught in any law school or college, nowhere, not a single book, all right, mentions the open casket funeral, which is the quintessential example of symbolic speech, right? There it is.
Yeah.
I want the world to see what they've done to my boy. And so it was just one of those incredible moments. And to also echo something you just said, Karla, that before Emmet went to Chicago, his mother spoke to him at some length about what
Mhm.
to do. If you see a white person on the same side of the street, go to the other side of the street. Put your head down. Don't talk. Be very respectful, Mr. or Ms. Don't give abbreviated answers. Don't look at them too long. And when Janae talked about that, Janae Nelson from the Legal Defense Fund, she called that the talk. And, as I didn't call it the talk because I'd never received the talk. I didn't know it was called the quote talk.
Yes, definitely.
And
Everyone, mothers still do that today.
although, but where I grew up in my part of the world, we weren't given the talk because we were the victims or the objects of that kind of discrimination. Let's cut to the trial, okay? I suspect that the only reason these guys were even charged, or not, they had been arrested for kidnapping and murder, but they were only charged for murder. I suspect that wouldn't even happen. That might not have happened but for the open casket funeral. But what it meant was that now all eyes were on that funeral, right? And so all of the Black press, Ebony, the Chicago Defender, Jet Magazine, a host of others, they're all there, and folks, NAACP field reps. Now you ask yourself, when these people come, where do they stay? The trial went on for several days. Where did they stay? I mean, there weren't any places for Black people to stay anywhere nearby there. And one of the guys that, I'd write a book about this fellow, but it's already been done. And one of the fellows is a guy named Dr. T.M. Howard, a very well-to-do African-American doctor who was pretty well off, had a big house, one would say even a mansion, on a big plot of land with a big fence around it. And so everybody stayed there, including Medgar Evers, who's one of the NAACP field reps, and the Black press, and Mamie Till. They stayed there. And he had guards out in front with guns. All right. It was kind of a sidebar sort of thing, but it was important, right? It was important. And T.R.M. Howard, Dr. T.R.M. Howard is a part of that story, all right? So much of what we know about the trial wouldn't have happened, or the witnesses wouldn't have had a place to stay if it weren't. Or some of the witnesses they wouldn't have found but for Medgar Evers going out and help finding some of the field hands who saw what had happened, or heard about what had happened, I should say. By the way, since I mentioned Medgar Evers, if you haven't heard Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn, it's on YouTube. And it's about Medgar Evers and Emmett Till, a really powerful song by Nina Simone, Mississippi Goddamn. But so let's cut to the trial. The courtroom it's about almost 100 degrees in there. It's terribly humid. The courtroom sits 250 people, 400 people are there. So it seats 250, 400 are there. People are smoking. There's a small section in the very back for African Americans. There's a card table that sits about 6 people for the African American press. All right. There's some ceiling fans and some windows open, but and I said, people are smoking. And catch this, the 2 defendants, Roy Bryant is there sitting maybe 15 feet from the witness stand. Roy Bryant, one of the defendants, he's smoking a cigar. And J.W. Milam, his brother-in-law, is also smoking a cigar and sitting back and reading a newspaper. Can you believe that? I mean, whoa. Meanwhile, their 2 little boys, for whom they rarely showed any affection, are there running around with cap guns, all right, at the outset of the trial. When the African-American press got up during the break, during the recess, people took their seats, so they had nowhere to sit. And this is what's going on. The judge, Curtis Swango, for a judge at the time, he was about as objective as you're going to get. Not that he was great, but he was remarkably objective. I mean, there were some rulings he made that I disagree with. The prosecution, for what it was at the time, was fairly good. the defense had four lawyers who, catch this, by the way, an all-white jury rendered its verdict after 62 minutes. They were, they would have taken, it would have taken them less time, but they had a soda break. They reportedly laughing. It was all white male jury. Women couldn't sit on juries at the time in Mississippi. But the typical story is all white male jury, the verdict was predictable. Yeah, that's true. But the fact is that the fix was in at the outset by the sheriff, H.C. Strider. The sheriff was working with the defense counsel. He helped them pick the jury. He took witnesses, all right, that could testify on behalf of the defense, on behalf of the prosecution, rather, and moved them to another jurisdiction and held them so they couldn't testify, right? He was called as a witness for the defense, the sheriff, right? So even if they had had an objective, quote unquote, jury, all right, it still would have been next to impossible. By the way, the prosecution had 13 days to make its case. And while they're doing this, the sheriff is not only not helping them, he's working with the defense, all right? And he owns this big plantation, and all of these Black folks are working for them. And he was a pretty stern fellow. And so this is the backdrop of the trial. And at one point, Mamie Till is called on the stand. Get this. They ask her, did you have any insurance on your son? Well, yes. By the way, that was not uncommon at the time, because you'd pay $5 and you could get insurance, life insurance or what have you. And not that you would ever use it, but in case, and it wasn't a lot of money. How much of this was a scam, we don't know. But anyway, they asked her, did you have life insurance on your boy? And she said, yes. And he said, do you plan to cash in on that? She said, well, I plan to collect the insurance. So with the help of the sheriff who held a press conference, he said, to the best of my knowledge, all right, Emmett Till is in another state. This whole thing has been set up by the NAACP, all right? They brought in a body, they dumped it in the Tallahatchie River, all right? This is all they're doing. They just want to create bad feelings in the South, all right, in Mississippi. So this whole thing is a scam, all right? And Emmett Till is still alive, and this is all a scam for the mother to collect insurance. That's what, and also to create race riots in Mississippi and elsewhere. This is their defense. The jury comes back. By the way, Moses writes, and also one of Emmett's cousins testify. They might as well sign the death warrant. They might as well sign a death warrant, because that was so dangerous what they did to testify. But be that as it may, after 62 minutes, some laughter and some sodas, the verdict comes back, not guilty of murder. Now, I just pause there. Notice I say murder, not kidnapping, because though they were arrested for kidnapping and murder, they're only charged with murder. Karla, take it from here. What is your sense?
There, unfortunately, still remnants of the Emmett Till trial in our criminal legal system today. The system that acquitted Till of the murders is a system that for decades has failed to convict police officers who kill unarmed Black people. It's a system the Legal Defense Fund has litigated many death penalty cases, from McCleskey versus Kemp to Furman versus Georgia, challenging the criminal legal system that disproportionately impacts Black people in this country. And Ron, what was very interesting when I cracked open your book, was the story behind the trial transcript. I did not know that it was hidden, and that it says a lot about the moment that we're in right now, where you have different states and localities who are trying to suppress how history is told. And the suppression of this trial transcript is, an element in a well-worn playbook that has been used to rewrite history and to suppress the truth from coming out. Um, I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask you a question about, discovering the trial transcript and navigating through it. One of the things, as a former law professor, I really enjoyed reading the footnotes because there's a story in each of the footnotes about the participants in the trial. So can you talk to us about when you got your hands on the trial transcript and what that process was like, kind of, rolling over the transcript and, resurfacing things that, you know, haven't been in our history books and haven't been taught in law school?
Somebody stumbles on a rock, lifts up the rock, and finds a precious stone, right? It's just kind of one of those accidental things. This book was the hardest book for me to publish. No publisher was, trial transcripts don't sell. I said, but this is a transcript of historic moment. Trial transcripts don't sell. But I've done this and that and explain it. They don't sell. So there was that problem. As you mentioned, the trial transcript had been missing for about a half century, just vanished, And then when it finally surfaced and the FBI got a copy, and it was a copy of a copy of a copy, it took them a while just to transcribe it and what have you. But what was missing was the closing arguments. There were for whatever reason, the court reporter didn't report the closing arguments. So I did a lot of research, and based largely on African-American newspapers, I was able to reconstruct or summarize them and kind of bring that back. And, when it comes to race, suppression, what have you, one of the things that's a constant is that history in time shines a new light, right? A light on darkness, and shows you things that had never been seen before. And I thought that's why we needed the whole transcript. It wasn't enough to just do a 200-page nice narrative, fast action, kind of made for movie sort of thing. We needed the actual document. And I tell you this, we're trying to do a K-12 version of this story. And I don't think, given current Mississippi law, it would be possible to do that in Mississippi and other states that basically have these suppression laws that make truth-telling when it comes to racial injustice either impossible or next to impossible. And I think that's a real problem. And I think it's one that your colleagues, and I know Janae, she has something very nice, comments on YouTube about book bans and this sort of thing. But so it was to me, and Secretary Lonnie Bunch, of the Smithsonian, when he was so kind to write the foreword to the book, or the introduction to the book, I think he realized the importance of that, and also of bringing the Emmett Till casket to the African-American Museum.
The museum.
Yeah, so when it comes to these sorts of things, truth is always evolving. And listen, when it evolves, at some point, it's going to make some of us uncomfortable. It's just how it works, all right? So as my mother used to say, deal with it, So against that backdrop, and I just want to be mindful of the time, let's just say a few things about the 1956, and this speaks to the very point that we're talking about, Karla, the 1956 Look magazine. So the defendants are found not guilty of murder, all right? In 1956, a freelance reporter named William Bradford Huey strikes a deal with the defendants and their lawyers. He pays them money to get their, quote, confessions as to the murder, right? Since they can say, yes, we murdered Emmett Till, because double jeopardy protects them, right? They were tried and found not guilty, so double jeopardy protects them. So he writes the story, he interviews them, he sells it to Look magazine. In 1956, Look magazine sells 6 million copies. It syndicates it for another 5 million. So in 1956 alone, 11 million copies. This is physical copies, 11 million. That is, today that would be a truckload, all right? And that story that William Bradford Huey wrote remains the kind of the constant for 60 years. A guy named Juan Williams writes a best-selling book called Eyes on the Prize, and it draws heavily on William Bradford Huey's Look magazine story. Thereafter, a documentary is made called Eyes on the Prize, and in the opening scenes, William Bradford Huey, all right, is there talking about the story. William Bradford Huey, after that Look magazine, became a civil rights journalist hero. Believe it or not, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote the foreword to one of his books, and Jesse Jackson as well. There was one problem. Half of what was in that story was a blatant lie, right? Just false. And I was able to document this by going to his papers. And here's the problem, and I'll just say this and we'll move on. When he was talking to the defendants, he can't say anything about kidnapping, right? Because if he does, they could be charged because they'd never been charged with kidnapping. So when he can't say them, well, when you took Emmet from this point to that point, he can't say anything like that because they could be charged. And well, where was the barn where this happened? Well, they can't mention the person who owned the barn, all right, J.W. Milam's brother, because that brother could be prosecuted. So they can't mention his name. Well, who helped load the body on the trucks? Well, they can't mention those guys because they could be prosecuted. If they were prosecuted, they could charge the defendants with kidnapping. So he's got to weasel around, right? So much of it was just a blatant lie. And yet, Juan Williams was conned, Martin Luther King was conned, Jesse Jackson was conned, the people who did Eyes on the Prize were conned. This is why truth-telling is such an important part of the narrative. Let me pause there, Karla. It's
definitely. I think one of the things that, as I was reading the book, I was thinking about the Legal Defense Fund, the Thurgood Marshall Institute released Recollection, a Civil Rights Legal Archive in October. And it is preserving and making public for free the legal history of the civil rights movement. And things like the trial transcript that you've surfaced through your book are now going to be available because we're digitizing all of LDF's records from the 1940s to the present. And it will, it's a long-term project, but it underscores the importance that these documents force us to confront our past in a way that can inform our present, especially today. How do we look at that trial transcript and teach it in K-12? How do we teach it in law schools so that lawyers understand that, how it impacts the criminal legal system and, the disproportionate, prosecution of Black people, Black and brown people in our country. So it's just so powerful to be able to just read the actual words as they were transcribed in your book, Ron. And it's, I think even more powerful when we think about how authors like you might engage with our website, Recollection, and bring these stories to light so that they can be taught, they can be remembered. And when you could talk about Eyes on the Prize, I remember when it came out, gathering around the TV with my family. And that was a defining moment for me and influenced my decision to take this path of becoming a civil rights lawyer. And just thinking about having this element of truth retold right now at this point in history is just, it's phenomenal. And I'm just so happy that we're able to take part in what you brought to light.
Well, I'm still in a good light, Peter, let's open it up and let folks be in the spirit of the First Amendment, uninhibited, robust, and wide open with questions or comments.
So yeah, we're still waiting for a few to come in. See if there's anything in the chat. Not yet.
By the way, while we're still looking, Karla, since you mentioned the Legal Defense Fund and the information you're making available, one of the things is one of my next books is about a fellow named Lewis Redding, a LDF lawyer who
Mhm.
the lawyers in the Brown v. Board case. He was defended. He was not defended. He brought actions against Delaware, and one of the companion cases in Brown v. Board was out of Delaware.
Yeah.
Story of legal defense lawyer Lewis Redding is an absolutely incredible story that hasn't
Mhm.
been told. So I'll be checking with you and your colleagues and
Yes,
the
for
Lewis
any
Redding
documents we have.
documents. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. So, how are we doing, Peter?
So, while we're waiting, actually, I have a question, and it's about the role of social media and how it can help or hinder court cases,
Mhm.
and what your thoughts both are on that.
Well, I think that one of the things that we struggle with as lawyers right now is storytelling and how storytelling comes across through social media in quick, sound bites. And one of the things that we always think about is how do we engage with the, younger generation so that they learn history, that they understand history, because the narratives that are created through trial transcripts like this do become history or should be a part of history. And so I think social media is, has its good and bad at the same time, in that we can get information like this out in quick sound bites. I think the thing that we have to do is figure out how to engage a younger generation to go beyond that soundbite. But I think that, social media, the video recording of police brutality, starting with Rodney King and then all for Emmett Till, Rodney King, George Floyd, all the way up, Sandra Bland, all the way up to the present, helps us to, information is disseminated very quickly. And we also know that the downside of that is, mis and disinformation is also quickly disseminated through social media. So it's a catch-22, can be used for good and has been used for evil too at the same time.
Let's see. Marcus asks, how closely does the 2022 film Till follow the actual events of Emmett's abduction and murder?
Very good question. Actually, it was a very good film. I mean, if you're a law professor, you kind of look over these things and you're in the weeds and what have you. Well, what about this? And what about that? And you left this out and left that out. But all in all, I thought it was a very good, I wish they would have spent more time on the trial, but no, I thought all in all, it was a very good portrayal. So many things are exaggerated in ways that aren't consistent with the truth, or sometimes they're not even consistent with the spirit of the truth, which I think is a real problem. But all in all, I think there's still more to be said about the Till trial, and I hope to be working with some folks, hopefully from the Legal Defense Fund, on doing a narrative book on the open casket funeral and the David Jackson photos. I think that is deserving of a book in its own right. But no, all in all, I think, by the way, when I did the book, there'd been so much written about Emmett Till, and all I thought is, what can I possibly add that hasn't been said a zillion times before? And that's why the trial. I mean, nobody had really covered the trial at any length. And so since I'd written about the Howell trial, right, which your boss, right, was the defendant in, and one of your other colleagues, and had written about the Lenny Bruce trial, it seemed that it was fine to, open invitation to write about the Emmett Till trial. So.
What about Ron, your experience going to Mississippi and being in the courtroom? What was it like
Yeah, well,
now today?
Distant Horizons had a civil rights tour, and I was just like, I don't work for Distant Horizons. I don't get any commission from them. They haven't asked me to plug them, but it was a wonderful tour. I guess it was through Vassar College, where my wife attended part of their program. And so, I found myself in the courtroom, and I was just awestruck. And I thought, and actually the courtroom has been restored, so what it actually looked like in 1955. And I was just awestruck. I thought, God, it happened here. This is where Judge Swanko sat. This is where the defendants sat. This is where the prosecution sat. And the fellow talking, I think, spoke for about 9 minutes and then spoke on something else. And I left like, and I started researching, and that I'd found that about in 2004, the FBI had found a copy of the transcript, and they just kind of posted it online on their site. And if you just read the transcript and you don't know anything about it, and you don't know who the players are, and there's no introductions and there's no explanation, it's the kind of thing that if you're a dirty lawyer, it kind of appeals to you, but otherwise, it just needed, a backstory and then plus it was missing the closing arguments. So I thought, well, this is something, if we can just piece it together, we kind of explain, so when we got to each of the people in the trial, I'd have a note and say who they were and their background. And so we knew something about them, and then divided into 12 parts and wrote introductions to each part. So I think, we come to know these things through music, Bob Dylan's song about Emmett Till, the song, Mississippi Goddamn by Nina Simone, sometimes by poets, and a number of poems have been written about Emmett Till. And sometimes even those of us with backgrounds in law can bring that story. And I think, by the way, so many times we think of protest as being limited to, going out into the streets, and more power to that. Right? I'm totally for all of that. But I think, you have the things like Lawrence Ferlinghetti did, or you have the things that Mamie Till did, that idea of that open casket funeral. I mean, we have to think about innovative ways to dissent. And I think Lawrence was totally there. I mean, completely there in his poetry, in his actions, in Lawrence Ferlinghetti, that is. The way he conducted himself, publishing Howl at the time, which is really the first gay rights manifesto kind of out there, in the 1950s. And so there's a number of ways we can express our views. And I think dissent is more important now than ever before. And I cannot say enough about Mamie Till Mobley and David Jackson. And I'm looking forward to writing that book. And please tell your colleagues at the Legal Defense Fund, I'm waiting to hear back from them.
We're definitely looking forward to collaborating with you on that. And I think you raised a point that's really good, important for the question that came in from someone from Virginia about the moment we're facing today. And to read her question from the chat, I'm very convinced the darkness falling now is bringing us to the precipice of a new civil rights era. Do you agree? Offer me a few talking points, please, Emmett Till or otherwise. I think some of the resources that the Legal Defense Fund has, we have a pro-truth website that talks about the efforts to suppress the teaching of Black history in Southern states. I think, and if you do Google LDF pro-truth, you'll find all of our resources and materials that can give you some of the language when you're in that meeting. One of the things that I was a law professor for a while, and then started working for the Legal Defense Fund about 2 years ago. And one thing that gives me light and hope are the young attorneys that I work with. They are just amazing. They are working around the clock. And they give me that light in, this very dark time that, despite all that's going on, that we are pushing on. Janae Nelson has been a fabulous leader to make sure that we are, pushing forward, that we're taking care of ourselves. And that's, I think we have to connect in community so that we can uplift each other during these dark times, and so we can be engaged with each other because it can get very heavy. So, walking in community together is very important right now.
Well, Ron, we're at the top of the hour. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I have some thoughts. Let's take the word final out.
Okay.
Because if you're 75 and somebody says final, it's a scary word.
My apologies.
No, I think when it comes in some respects, the Till story is a story of rebirth. And I think Jesse Jackson said, because when Mamie Till had that open casket funeral and David Jackson took those photos and Robert Johnson published them, it was almost as if Emmet had resurrected, right? And from tragedy came grace. And I think, Albert Camus, as I might have said, once said, I do not give the human race more than one chance in 1,000, but I would be less than a man if I did not act on that chance. It's an incredible line. And when there's so much evil in the world, and no, there's not goodness on both sides. There's evil. There's evil in the world. It was in the world in 1955, and it's in the world in 2025. And no, it's not a case of being partisan or nonpartisan. Evil is evil. Tyranny is tyranny, all right? And like Mamie Till Bradley, Mamie Till Mobley, we have to be willing to speak out against it. We can't remain silent. As Lawrence Ferlinghetti said, silence is complicity, all right? And I think more than ever, however we do it, if we do it through poetry, if we do it through protest, if we do it through the courts, if we do it through education, however we do it, if we do it through a novel, all right, we must do it, all right? And that to me brings me back, and forgive me, I don't mean to sound sycophantic, but I think City Lights is just a wonderful paradigm for that, because you folks stand, for decades and decades and decades for the importance of civil rights, for the importance of civil liberties, for the importance of dissent, all right, for poetry as an insurgent art. And I think, if that is our marching orders, if we think about it in that term, it's not always so important whether we win at the particular moment. What's important, I think, for me anyway, is that we tried. And I think in that respect, what the ACLU is doing, what Legal Defense is doing, what City Lights is doing, what environmental groups are doing, and what other activists are doing is more important now than ever. And I commend all of those, like the folks at City Lights, like the folks at the National ACLU, like the folks at the Legal Defense Fund. And I'm delighted whenever I can to be a part of that. And it is a great honor, Karla, to work with you and your colleagues. Peter, as always, to be part of what City Lights is doing. And to my friends out there who I see, I thank all of them for the things that they are doing. And it's a wonderful feeling for me to be a part of that. And by the way, lest I forget, Susan Cohen, my wife, has for 40 years worked on reproductive rights. And that is another very, very important cause that we ought not lose the sight of. And I'm glad to mention Susan and all of the incredible work she has done in the past and continues to do so. So those are some of my thoughts, Peter, but by no means final. Let me just leave with Karla. Let's give her since you're younger, I'll give you the final words, Karla.
Well, thank you for allowing me to engage with your wonderful work. It's just been a pleasure and introducing me to City Lights too through this conversation. I also want to thank my dad. You know, no matter how old I get, he always shows up. He showed up to this event, and I talked to him yesterday, and he allowed me to share his story with the group tonight. And so I just want to, I think that the work that Ron has done through this book is really important for us to uplift and share because you know, this story is gives us hope. It also helps us to understand the criminal legal system. So I think, you know, I just want to thank City Lights and Ron for inviting me to engage in this conversation. And I look forward to working with you both and people on this call and community to as we face this particular moment. Thank you.
Well, much gratitude to the both of you for gracing our virtual halls. It has been such an honor. Karla McKanders, thank you for all the good work that you do. We really appreciate it. Ron Collins, congratulations on this new book. Always a pleasure having you with us. And of course, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Take care, stay strong, fight the good fight, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks again. Ron, thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. Be well.